Sir, you are live.
Okay, good evening, friends. Welcome once again to this beautiful, unique Clinical Pulse program, a unique PG track program initiative of Delhi CSI branch. I welcome you again to the third webinar of the series. After the great success, academic success of the first two webinars, in which we tried to cover parts of cyanotic congenital heart disease in an approach to a case of pulmonary arterial hypertension. Today we are going to talk about approach to a patient with multiple valvular heart disease. Now this is one of the cases you are definitely going to get in your exam. And who could have been a better speaker than Professor S. Ramakrishnan from the Department of Cardiology, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, who has consented to join us today with this on this journey. Along with this, we have two fantastic panelists. Our dear friend, Dr. Sanjay Mittal, who is Senior Director of Clinical Cardiology and Research in the Medanta Medicity, a great academician. And we also have the privilege of having Professor S.C. Manchanda, who is Senior Consultant of Sir Gangaram Hospital and ex-head of the Department of Cardiology of All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So over to you, Dr. Sanjay, for starting the session. Welcome to you all from behalf of Delhi CSI, and also thank INTAS for helping us in designing this beautiful platform and this. I also welcome my colleague Dr. Girish, who will be moderating this session along with.
Thanks, Mohit. I think this is a wonderful topic, and as you said very rightly, it's one thing which is definitely going to come in exams. And I think what we should do now is I would hand over the mic to Dr. Rama so that he can brief us about the topic itself, and then we can have question and answers towards the end. So, not wasting any more time, over to you, Dr. Rama.
Thank you, Dr. Mohit, and thank you, Dr. Sanjay, for such a wonderful introduction. I think I'm going to today deal about an approach to a patient with multivalvular heart disease. So we can deal it at very different facets. So what I'm going to deal it is more like more towards a clinical approach and the thing that is useful in your examination. So I think what are the causes of multivalvular heart disease? I think this list, I think all of you are aware, but most important cause and the only one cause that you commonly encounter in the exam is going to be rheumatic heart disease. So everybody asks, like, why should we have, once you pass out, everybody has a feeling that why should you have rheumatic heart disease as the long case in the exams? There is no escape. First of all, you have to accept the challenge, and it's not a fight for your life. Obviously, I think failing an exam is hardly nothing. Like, for example, 6 months is nothing in life. You have a long life to go. Only problem is you have to face your in-laws. That is a serious problem. You have to take control in the exams as well as in your life. So I think RSD case, in an essence, brings out a lot of uncertainty in life as well as in medicine. I think medicine is an inexact science. We all know that. And a case in RSD, especially clinical case, while the way you dichotomize everything and put weightage to each point, and I think that brings out a lot of this fallacies of medicine into vogue. And it's a good case, a good scenario where I think an examiner can get a feel of what you think, what is your thought process, how much you know is not more important than what you are able to apply. That is what is being tested. So it's always an examiner's delight as well as examiner's nightmare. And I think the most important reason why RSD cases have withstood the test of time over years is a primary test of synthesis. Whether you are able to synthesize your hypothesis, whether you are able to put weightage to each point, like which is more important, which is less important, which I think over time you will all realize that we all keep on doing it day in and day out in your patient care. And this is best taken out by an RSD case. There are so many ifs and buts in that case, examination finding wise, history wise, so much is there. So I think that is why this remains a very good delight for the examiners, as well as it always remains a nightmare for the examinees. So there are various complexities, because many of you argue like regurgitation, echo is facing a lot of tough competition from MRI. Valve area is totally different from cath, echo, and 3D. Why should we be asked by clinical auscultation to make a commitment towards whether it is moderate or severe? Where I think there is a big controversy between echo and 3D echo and cath. And then what about valve resistance as a concept compared to valve area? And there's a whole new gamut of low gradient severe AS. What this stethoscope has to do with it? And there is a big lack of evidence base comes to total valvular heart disease, mostly rheumatic heart disease, and especially clinical auscultation and clinical examination. There is absolute lack of evidence base. And then the most important thing is, especially for the people who are not inside major institutions, there is a big lack of exposure. And importantly, there is declining clinical skills. So I think these are very important complexities that are there. But still, the most important thing is it brings out a lot of your thought process. How do you approach a case? How much importance you give, and a detailed history taking, all those things comes into the picture. And how do you analyze your history? How do you place various examination findings and synthesize your diagnosis? I think everything comes out in this case. That is why it still remains a good long case. So how do you approach a clinical approach? It starts from the way patient walks into your clinic, and then it starts from the history, obviously. So the most important thing is history of rheumatic fever. Is there a history of rheumatic fever? And what is the latency from the episode of rheumatic fever? So when the rheumatic fever episodes occurred, and now where is he now? And then what is the onset of symptoms? And what are the symptoms that started with, like whether he started with a PND, orthopnea, or there was early heart failure? You can dichotomize between various diseases in this disease, like various valve lesions in this disease. And what has been the course of the symptoms? What is the that brings in a lot of natural history and combination of symptoms, and what are the specific symptoms for a particular valve lesions, and then what are the precipitating factors, and so on and so forth. All these things should be brought out nicely in a story form, and the story should not be too long or too short. It has to be appropriate for the particular thing, and there has to be emphasis. It cannot be monotone. It has to be you have to bring out the best whatever the patient has told. So you should not put in too many of your own words, but then best will be to synthesize it into a good story. But that should cover all the facets in a way that everybody can easily understand, because all of them are important. So for example, what are the specific symptoms that you're looking at? I think all of you are aware, angina and syncope are very specific for aortic stenosis out of all the valvular lesions that you have. And then hemoptysis happens only in MS, and palpitations predominantly in AR, unless there is arrhythmic type palpitation. Volume overload palpitation is very classical for AR. And then prominent neck pulsations can happen with venous as well as arterial thing with AR and TR. So these are the specific symptoms, but we always look for the starting point being rheumatic fever. So I will briefly touch about some salient aspects of rheumatic fever that all the residents should know before I actually go into the approach to a valvular heart disease. So what is the frequency of a rheumatic fever valve involvement in a rheumatic fever? This is the first episode of rheumatic fever. 70 to 75% of patients will have mitral valve involvement, and both the valves are involved in 20 to 25%, and only 5 to 8% have only predominantly aortic valve involvement. And invariably you find this is clinical, so mostly find echo. Invariably you will find some mitral valve abnormalities in all. And there are some important numbers that you have all to know. Many times this is asked, like how common is carditis in first episode of rheumatic fever? That is varies from 30 to 70%, and it all depends on whether you are looking clinically or subclinically. And then by echo, the carditis in all attacks, even clinically, goes up to 70 to 100% nearly. Whereas prospective studies actually have shown only 33 to 46% develop carditis, because many times only we as a cardiologist in a tertiary care institute are likely to see patients who have established rheumatic heart disease. But these are some important numbers that you should know. So what is the chance of somebody having an established rheumatic heart disease 5 to 10 years on follow-up? So if he has one episode of rheumatic fever, the chances are roughly around 2/3. Once carditis, it is roughly around 45 to 80%, roughly say around 50-60% is the average. And if chorea is around 1/3, 20 to 34%, actually have a chance of rheumatic heart disease on follow-up. These are some important numbers, all of you should be aware. And what determines, suppose somebody has an episode of rheumatic fever initially, so what determines that patient will develop rheumatic heart disease on follow-up? So I think the most important predictor is presence or absence of heart failure in the first episode of rheumatic fever, and then severity of mitral regurgitation. So in other words, you can actually look at it the other way around. So majority of patients with mild MR are going to regress at 5 years. Majority are going to regress at 5 years, whereas I think at least 70 to 80% of patients, 75% of patients with severe MR are likely to have persistent of RST. So that means at least around 20% of patients with severe MR also may regress, or they may actually eventually die also. But heart failure is something, presence of heart failure and severity of MR during first episode of rheumatic fever are the most important predictors of subsequent rheumatic heart disease and follow-up. So what about the distribution of RSD? So most of the patients, we all know 5 to 15 years, they have the first episode of rheumatic fever. Then obviously the pure MR is the predominant valve lesion, and very few patients actually have pure MS. A very relative prevalence starts around 10%, and the prevalence of rheumatic MR as a predominant lesion comes down. There is a crossover happening around 25 years. Beyond 25 years, mixed valve lesions or pure MS actually are the dominant lesions, not severe MR per se. This is how the mitral valve lesion distribution is in RSD. So most of you are asked about what is the most common lesion, what is the most common combination. All of them used to have various references, but I think you should all now go through two important references. That is this EuroHeart survey published in 2003, which suggests the various combinations and the multiple. In this cohort of 5,000 patients, multiple heart disease happened in 20% of patients, out of which the native heart disease was around 72%. And I think contemporary Indian series, I think is the best one to quote, where I think Professor Manjunath has published a large series from Jayadeva. They have included nearly around 136,000 patients with valvular lesions have been included. And this is a good quote for what are the combinations that are more common, like in terms of multivalvular lesions. So more than 1/3 of patients had multivalvular lesions. The order of involvement was MS plus MR was the most frequent. Then you have MS with AR. Then you have AR and MR. Then you have AS with AR. Then you have MR with AS. Not only this, not only RST alone. So basically, most of the patients were RST. So I think then you have multiple other combinations were there. And 9% of patients had organic tricuspidal disease. This is a very good data that you all can quote in your exams. So I think coming to aortic regurgitation, many of the times you find predominant aortic regurgitation in your patients. So you often wonder what would be the causes. I think again this pattern is quite interesting. So I think predominant aortic regurgitation, isolated AR is only 5.8%, but rheumatic is still the predominant cause of aortic regurgitation. Then you have bicuspid as the second common. Then you have congenital, then sclerotic, and then aortic root diseases and sclerotic are equally prevalent among this series. Coming to the, as I told you, multivalvular, coming to the prevalence of AR, out of all the prevalent multivalvular lesions, I think the most important ones are MS with AR at 26.5% and MR with AR at around 23.3%. So in multivalvular heart disease, MS-MR is the most dominant combination, followed by MS with AR, followed by MR with AR. So I think this is a very good data all of you should go through and then should be able to quote. Coming to the natural history, like many of us are being asked, like the natural history, how do things go? Suppose you have you present a natural history. You say the patient started symptomatic at this age and has been progressing like this, and so much so happened. So I think oftentimes you are asked, like, what is the natural history of MS? What is the natural history of MR? And what is the natural history of AR? I think very few data are actually available in the current era. I think this is one very good data of rheumatic aortic regurgitation, where actually they have come up with some numbers. I think these are the numbers that you should know, that asymptomatic AR progression to LV dysfunction is 6% per year, and asymptomatic LV dysfunction development of symptoms is around 25% per year, and symptomatic severe AR mortality is around 10% per year. So I think this is the data that is available in rheumatic aortic regurgitation, but such data are actually not available in the current era with MS, MR, and AS, AR, and other diseases. Only AR we have such data. I think all of you, I would suggest, should go through the cardiology update that was released in last CSI. I think that has few good chapters of natural history of rheumatic valvular lesions, especially natural history of MS and all, very well put forth by one of our colleagues, Dr. Vivek Chaturvedi. So I think you should all go through. That has given a lot of things. But I think there is a bit of a new thing that has come up in that paper, in that chapter. I think all of us have been, we know that one thing, I think if a patient develops symptoms and the symptoms are very least progressive or very progressive minimally over a long time, then we are generally thinking that it is likely to be mitral stenosis and regurgitation. Because in regurgitation, there will be a long latent phase, but when the patient becomes symptomatic, the progression of symptoms is pretty fast. That is what we have been told. But if you go through that natural history of MS in India, per se, some of the studies that are available from the other tropical areas and Africa, it suggests that possibly MS per se may not be so innocent as we possibly think. Another common question that all of us is, all the examiners ask is modified, the revised Jones criteria. Which I think most of you are aware. I think without this, nobody should appear in the exam, obviously. And what are the differences, you should all know. And then most of the time you falter when you are asked how this differentiation is made between the low risk population and the high risk population. So I think that the low risk population is AR of incidence of 2 per 1 lakh, this thing, and then all the age prevalence is 1 per 1,000. I think this is the only data that is available is the annual incidence of ARF in our country. I think this is the possibly the only very few papers that are available based on population-based studies and surveillance. It's around 8.7 per 1 lakh population is the incidence of ARF. So I think the Jones criteria revision, these are the major revision that has, these are the differences that has happened. So in the moderate or high risk population, you have monoarthritis, arthralgia being included as one of the diagnostic criteria. You have monoarthralgia, and then cutoffs of fever and ESR have been changed. I think this all of you should be aware. So some numbers about rheumatic fever is essential to know. So generally, sore throats are very frequent in less than 10 years of age. They have around 4 to 6 episodes per year, and out of which streptococcal, depending on, varies from 1.5 to 19%, like around 2% to 20%, you can say, is streptococcal sore throat, out of which 50% are asymptomatic and 25% can be carrier state. And this is a commonly asked question: how often patient with streptococcal sore throat develop? Epidemic versus endemic areas, 0.3 to 3% is what they develop acute rheumatic fever, and around 20 to 30% of them ultimately end up having rheumatic heart disease. This schematic diagram, I think all of you should be aware of. And the acute rheumatic fever follows certain rules, and it's quite fairly obedient. I think it used to be like one of the earlier era students. I think it generally is early carditis. So in the course of a rheumatic heart disease, carditis rarely develop after 2 weeks of illness, and then rarely it is prolonged after 6 to 8 weeks of illness. And then nodules, subcutaneous nodules, almost always means presence of carditis. And then endocardium is pretty central to the whole thing. And pericarditis and heart failure never occurred without valvular involvement. And it is mostly self-limiting. So as I told, it's 8 to 12 weeks in 95% of people. And arthritis is generally non-deforming, and it has typical joint involvements. And there are some good thing is recurrence begets recurrences. And then it's a mimetic carditis. Whatever be the first episode, generally is like the repeat episodes. And there are some exceptions to the rule, like indolent carditis. What is indolent carditis? What is inapparent or silent carditis? And what is Jacquard arthritis? These are the various exceptions to the rule. I think all of you should be aware. And one more thing that you should know, for example, you have a short latent period or a long course, I think you should think of post-streptococcal reactive arthritis all the time. So it has a very short latent period. It is 3 days to 2 weeks, and then it's a non-migratory arthritis, and large and small joints or axial skeleton is involved in 20% of the times, and the patient can actually report morning stiffness, and there is a poor response to aspirin and NSAIDs, and they can persist for 1 week to 8 months. Mean is 2 months. So I think one of your features, like some of the features in your index case, is having some of these atypical features. You should think of the post-streptococcal reactive arthritis, and this can actually result in permanent damage. Most importantly, it could be actually be a separate entity, or it could be a part of the spectrum of rheumatic streptococcal diseases, and it could be because 6% of them on the long run ultimately develop rheumatic heart disease on the long run. So we don't know whether it is a variation or a separate entity till. As I told you, rheumatic fever can pretty well regress. I think some of the numbers that you should know based on the clinical series as well as the echocardiographic series. There are very few echocardiographic series are available, but then most of the mild carditis or minimal carditis generally improve over time. So one more thing is, you are often asked in the exams, so how often you find a history of acute rheumatic fever in the case. And this is a very good data from the Remedy study. which is a India and Africa, mainly from Africa. You have a 3,000 patients data. I think all the contemporary statistics, this is a paper that you should be quoting, where I think 40.7% of patients had a history of past history, could recollect a past history of acute rheumatic fever, and heart failure was there in 33%, pulmonary hypertension was there in 28.8%, stroke was there in 7.1%, endocarditis was there in 4%. So most of the data that you are asked, I think you can quote this for the outcome based. Is one of the best outcome based data that are available. I think I think all of you should be aware. This is called Remedy study. I think this is something that you should be aware of. So I think I've given you a lot of spoon feeding about the common questions that are being asked, and the common thing that has to be covered before you venture into the exam hall about rheumatic fever and rheumatic heart disease. But ultimately, you have to present the case, and what are we assessing? So suppose this is a very prototype case. For example, it's a rheumatic heart disease, severe MS, moderate MR, severe AR in congestive heart failure, normal sinus rhythm, NOHA functional class 3 with no evidence of rheumatic fever and infected endocarditis. Is the diagnosis complete? No. You're not assessed about pulmonary venous hypertension, pulmonary arterial hypertension, and a clinical assessment, if possible, about LV function are some of the precipitating factors for worsening, like anemia or other factors that could be there. So all of them should feature in your diagnosis. I think I would say a whole complete assessment has 9 components. 9 components. Remember this. Just always recheck once you have written it. So you put out the severity and combination of valvular lesions in an RST case, and then you say functional class. You have heart failure. So functional class and heart failure come together. You say about rhythm. You have PVH, PAH, you have left ventricular function, you have features of carditis, acute heart disease are there, features of infected endocarditis are there or not, and precipitating factors are there or not. So basically, I would say the current status, like class and heart failure, and you have the other features like ventricular function, rhythm, and PVH and PAH, and the accompaniments like other factors like carditis, infected endocarditis, and precipitating factors. All these 9 should feature in your complete diagnosis in any long case, preferably in a RST long case. They all have to be there. So how do you assess them? It's pretty simple. I would say there are 9 features that you have to assess, and all the severity and combination, all of them that you have put together should match 9 clinical features that I'm going to describe you. All this is well known. I think all of you are well, you have been practicing this. But this is where you all falter. This is exactly where you all falter. You have put in all the combination in your final diagnosis, but then try to match them with 3 features in general examination, that is pulse, JVP, and blood pressure, and 3 features in your palpation and inspection and palpation, that is apical impulse, parasternal heave and thrill, and then 3 features in your auscultation, that is heart sounds, murmurs, and added sounds. Heart sounds, added sounds, and murmurs. So this is essentially what you should do. What I would suggest is, many of you have enough time once you finish your assessment of the exams, before you are called to the examiner, then you always match these 9 clinical features with your final diagnosis. Many a time, this is where you all falter. What I mean to say is, you would have said no heart failure, or you would have said heart failure, but it won't be matching with your JVP findings, liver findings, and fetal edema findings. So most of the time, why JVP is elevated if you say no heart failure? It's a very common immediate question that comes up. So you would say severe AS, but then you would not have described peaking of the murmur in AS or rate of rise of pulse in your pulse description. So these are some of the things that you should match. So I think once you know all the features, I think most of you know, but then you should practice this. Like they all have to match the pulse, BP, and JVP, apical impulse, parasternal heave and thrill, and the sounds, added sounds, and murmurs should match with your diagnosis. Coming to the heart sounds per se, I think the capacity of human hair is 30 to 15,000 hertz, and 20 millisecond apart we can hear. And most cardiovascular sounds are from 30,000 hertz. And the 3 characteristics of any heart sound is the intensity of the sound, the pitch of the sound, and the quality of the sound. And then the high frequency sounds are related to opening or closing, that is opening snap and ejection sounds. And you have closure sounds like S1 and S2. Low frequency sounds are the early and late diastolic filling events of the ventricle. I think this is a very classical picture that I think tells you about the commonly asked question, like what is the audible frequency and what is the live threshold and all those things. This is a very classic picture where you can heart sounds are superimposed on the our human capacity. And this is how the various murmurs are described, like low pitch, medium pitch, and high pitch, depending on the hertz. And it's very important. Like it's not about why you are describing a high pitch murmur as a low pitch murmur, because you're not understanding at the DM level. At a DM level, all the things are same. You present an MS with AR patient, the same you would have presented in your undergraduate exam also. The same thing you would have presented. What we are trying to assess, whether you know the natural history that is in addition to what you know in your undergraduate days, and whether you know the hemodynamics behind the production of the murmurs and the various clinical findings. That is what we are actually looking at. Once you describe a high pitch murmur as a low pitch murmur, immediately the examiner pounces on you. That is because you don't know what determines the pitch, and you don't know, you're not thinking about that particular valve lesion that you're describing. That is why we immediately pounce on you. So the pitch of the murmur depends on the pressure gradient, the pressure difference of the gradient, and the amount of flow. I think you have a low pitch murmurs have a rumbling quality. Classical example is mitral stenosis, and the medium pitch murmurs are harsh. They are like the AS murmurs. The high pitch murmurs, they have a quality of blowing quality. The classical being AR murmur, which is a very good blowing quality murmur. So another important thing, oftentimes you are asked, you describe the murmur, where the murmur starts, where it ends. That is because whether you understand this cycle or not. That is what the examiner wants. Am I clear? So the murmurs that actually start from the ventricle are supposed to start when everything is closed. That is isovolumetric contraction time. Also, there will be a murmur. So that is the difference between the pansystolic murmur and the ejection systolic murmur. Where the ejection systolic murmur starts, where the pansystolic murmur starts, where it ends, where the PDA murmur starts, and where the PDA murmur ends. All this is asked because whether you understand the basic physiology. All of you should be at DM level, should be able to draw this curve, this diagram, along with the murmur that you are describing. So the best way to start is start drawing the ECG, and then JVP, and then you start drawing your murmur and put the sounds, and then start drawing the murmurs. This all of you should be aware. So this is very important. Once you keep on practicing it, it's very simple. It doesn't take more than 2 hours to learn the whole things about all the murmurs. So you just can practice this very easily. And once you know this, it's absolutely nothing. All these questions are actually will look stupid to you once you understand the premise behind all these questions. That's very simple. So moving on to now individual lesions. Like, so most often you describe something as severe MS. Most often you are asked, like, why do you say it's severe MS? This is where the importance comes. So what are the most important things that will tell you that this is a severe MS? The most important things are the duration of the murmur, a prolonged diastolic murmur accompanied by a thrill, and a narrow A to YS gap. These will give you the most important clues to say this is severe MS. Presence of pulmonary hypertension, cardiomegaly, congestive heart failure, they all will help you if this is an isolated severe MS. In a multivalvular heart disease, these could be happening, even though pulmonary hypertension is a more common or more early feature of severe MS compared to other valvular lesions. So, but cardiomegaly can be there because of an AR, for example. Then you have to distinguish whether it's an RV type of apex or whether it's a LV type of apex because of volume overload in a patient with MS with AR. So, presence of AF, intensity of murmur, and pre-systolic accentuation alone do not correlate with severity of mitral stenosis. So, in a multivalvular lesion, when you have multiple things, the things that stand out that will say this is mitral stenosis, if they are there, is prolonged diastolic murmur, a thrill, and A to YS gap generally tell you that the patient is likely to have severe MS. And disproportionate to other valve severity, if there is pulmonary hypertension also, you can ascribe this to severe MS. So even A to YS gap has a lot of fallacies in a multivalvular lesion, which I will be discussing about this in detail. So coming to, because opening snap is a very important thing. Commonly you are asked about how do you differentiate opening snap with from A to P2. I think this all of you should be know how is the respiratory variation, postural variations, and what is the interval and where it is best heard. And the most important difference is between opening snap and S3, because that can change. For example, in a patient who has MS and MR or MS with AR, whether it's opening snap or S3 will totally change the severity of the lesions. So this is very important differentiation that you should know. The opening snap is generally heard everywhere, and it's generally best heard at the apex or midway between apex and the left sternal border, whereas S3 is generally localized and it is to the apex. It's a low pitch sound and the interval is slightly more prolonged than the A2YS gap, and the pitch is high pitch sound for an opening snap, and generally posteriorly it can widen on standing, whereas S3 doesn't change. And this is another thing that I think all of you should be aware of, where each of the diastolic sounds and where the ejection sounds happen. The ejection sound, the closing clicks, the opening sound, the tumor plop, the S3 and S4, and then the relative time zones from S2. I think all of you should be knowing this. The pericardial knock. So the opening snap, pericardial knock, tumor plop, and S3 is the correct order in which all the diastolic sounds happen. So A2OS gap, I think, is a very important thing when it comes to a cardiologist. Like, what is the gap in a given case of mitral stenosis? It is generally inversely proportional to severity. It is 40 to 120 milliseconds, and it depends on a lot of things like heart rate, LA pressure, LV-EDP, LV compliance, and mobility. So remember this: narrow always means tight MS, but it can be falsely widened in the presence of bradycardia, aortic regurgitation, low output state, and increased LV-ED. And how do you differentiate? You may think of what nonsense is this, why is sumgya a badi baat hai? But then you can easily make out whether it is what kind of duration it is. It is quite narrow, or it's pada, pata, papa. So this can actually say the distinction. Like, whereas most of the thing is the S3 gap as well as the pericardial knock are generally pretty late. So these are the list of factors that affect the A2YS gap. So anything that increases LV-EDP, aortic stenosis or severe hypertension, calcific mitral valve increases, LV dysfunction increases it, bradycardia increases it, and tachycardia decreases it, as well as aortic regurgitation have various effects, and then mitral regurgitation can actually decrease it. Old age, it increases it. So what happens in AF, A2YS gap in AF? If the preceding cycle is short, if you have a A2YS gap, which is preceding cycle is short, the LA pressures will be high and the A2YS interval will be short for the subsequent cycle. The QS1, that is QM1 minus A2YS interval, is called the Wells index, and it is actually fairly constant for the varying cycles of AF that I think some of the examiners are fond of asking. I think murmur of MS, I don't need to go through the thing. All of you know how to describe it. But the most important thing is whether there is pre-systolic accentuation is there or not, whether it is accompanied by a thrill or not, and the duration of the murmur are very important thing. I think all of you are murmur. You should look back at your echo trace. All of your echo generation people, like, you are all learning valvular heart disease from echo, and then now you are auscultating before your exams. So I think all of you should now think back and look at your echo trace. Whatever you find in echo trace in gradients between the valves is what is the murmur that we are asking. So you think of a mild MS, how the graph will be, and that is what you are asking to describe what you are getting. How the murmur, how the trace will be in a severe MS, how the trace will be like a mild MS. You think of it the same thing that we are asking in your clinical auscultation. So I think once this generation, if you all think back from your echo traces into describing murmurs, you will all be finding it very easy. So it has two components: the early diastolic component that begins with or just after the opening snap, and then corresponds to the rapid filling phase of the diastole, and the late diastolic or the pre-systolic murmur that follows left atrial contraction and represents sudden increase in the transmitral flow and velocity prior to the valve closure. Can this pre-systolic component happen in atrial fibrillation? It may happen, but not in all patients, but it happens in specific situation. I think that is something that I'm not going to tell you. You have to go and refer. I think this can happen in AF. Why it happens, then you should tell me. And because MS is almost always there, I thought of describing MS in more detail, clinical findings. These are the factors that decrease the intensity of diastolic rumble. I think many of these aspects are very nicely covered by Professor Balachandar in the same PG Cardiology Essentials that we came up in the last CSI by Professor Goswami. So I think this chapter is fantastic. You have to go through that. It's written by Professor Balachandra. He has described all the things I am telling you and much more than what I am telling you. So factors decreasing the intensity of diastolic rumble is the low flow. The flow is not there. Why the murmur is low? Because murmur has to be produced means what are the things? The flow has to be there, or some other lesion is affecting it. The mitral valve itself is creating a problem, or you are not able to hear. These are the factors that are possible. So severe MS, severe PH, heart failure, AF with fast ventricular rate, or the low flow states, features of mitral valve, calcification, subvalvular obliteration, left atrial thrombus protruding, which is very rare, very rare, and then postomedial deviation of the mitral orifice. Associated lesions like aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation, ASD, PH with marked RV dilatation where the whole valve is shifted. These all can actually decrease the intensity of MS murmur. And then obesity and COPD, which all know that can decrease almost all the sounds. Another common question is, what is juvenile mitral stenosis? This is one of the good contributions from All India Institute of Medical Sciences by Dr. Sujay B. Roy. Severe MS at an early age, before 20 years of age, rapid progression of stenosis, thickened mitral valve with severe subvalvular deformity but no calcification, severe pulmonary hypertension will be there. Presentation is in NYHA class 3 or 4. Sinus rhythm in most of the cases, that is thromboembolism and AF are rare. So children within less than 12 years may be worse off due to malignant nature of the disease in the developing country. This is what is juvenile mitral stenosis. I think all of the features are pretty simple, I think. So moving on to MR. So how do you assess severity of MR? What are the important features? Presence of cardiomegaly, LVS3 or diastolic murmur, wide split S2. Presence of a thrill is generally not accepted by most of the examiner, but I know some other textbooks have written presence of a severe MR thrill. But rheumatic heart disease, especially anteriorly directed chest, in most of our thin patients, it may not indicate severe MR. Presence of LV dysfunction, pulmonary hypertension, congestive heart failure, even though they are very rare signs, they are the features that suggest the particular patient has severe MR. But in a patient who has multivalvular heart disease, I think MR severity is the most difficult things to estimate, because cardiomegaly can be because of multiple things. LVS3 and diastolic murmur can be because of MS or Austin Flint murmur in AR, or S3 could be there. And then LV dysfunction can be because of AS or something else. And then the only thing that stands out in a multivalvular heart disease is wide split S2. So out of all the valvular lesions that you have, MR assessment of MR severity is the most difficult one in a multivalvular situation. You can best guess, and this is one situation where most of the learned examiners will accept. You say moderate to severe, very grade your MR, it's okay. But nobody is going to accept if you say, sir, it is moderate AR or severe AR. So you cannot be borderline in those situations. But in a multivalvular lesion, where the multiple valvular lesions, if you're not sure about MR severity, then you can get away with it, provided you are able to defend everything. Coming to AR, the most important features that suggest severe AR are presence of Hill sign, the duration of the diastolic murmur, the presence of an Austin murmur, thrill is extremely rare, and presence of cardiomegaly, S3 and LV dysfunction. Almost negligible amount of patients will have pulmonary hypertension and congestive heart failure because of isolated severe AR. So the things that stand out in a multivalvular lesion are presence of a Hill sign, duration of diastolic murmur, Austin Flint murmur, and if there is a thrill, you can think of. Hill sign, I think, is a very important sign in clinical cardiology as the way we practice. I think normal is less than 20, 20 to 40 is mild, 40 to 60 is moderate, greater than 60 is severe, maybe falsely low in LV dysfunction and acute AR, and in patients who have associated AS. And out of all the lesions, as I told you, AR is the only lesion which has natural history studies also, and AR is the only thing that has been assessed systematically for the clinical signs have been assessed systematically for how good they are. So sensitivity, specificity. Look at the sensitivity and specificity. Corrigan pulse is specific is 16%, sensitive is 38 to 95%. Dorosive sign is 35 to 100, 33 to 81. Hill sign is 71 to 100, sensitive is 0 to 100 overall. So moderate to severe, it increases to 75 to 100. So I think it's not a very large study, but it had 90 patients. I think if you scrutinize all our clinical findings, why I put up this slide is, you have to understand that all these signs that we describe and we vehemently teach also are not gold standard or cannot withstand the test of time. And there is always a fallacy. There is always an exception to the rule. So I think you should know where to put your money. That is the only thing that we are looking at. Whether nobody can make a perfect diagnosis. We are not actually expecting you to make a perfect diagnosis. Whether you are able to bring out all the complexities and put and discuss, have a clean thought process, that is what we are looking at. And more often than not, your marks go down if your findings don't match up with what you are saying. So Hillstein, whether it's an artifact or a fact, it has been widely debated, and I think mostly now people have accepted that possibly it's actually sphygmomanometric artifact, and it has no physiological basis. It apparently absent in patients with severe aortic deficiency. Still, I would say that is because intra-arterial pressure measurements did not demonstrate any exaggerated difference between femoral and axillary arteries. So, I think still it's a good clinical science. It's pretty easy to manifest, and if it is there, it will help you in grading the severity of AR. So, I think heart sounds in AR, I think it's actually normal to decrease. The S2 could be loud in aortic root diseases, and you can have a most of the time absent a single or narrow paradoxal split due to inaudible A2, and S3 not in mild to moderate AR. And severe AR, it increased LV diastolic blood volume. S4 is rare finding, and Ejection click is so I think the murmur of AR is a high pitched blowing murmur. It can be rough in severe AR. It's a decrescendo diastolic murmur just after A2, best heard in the third intercostal space. It's a hollow diastolic murmur in severe AR. You can hear it with the best the diaphragm of the stethoscope. The patient is sitting and leaning. All of this you know. At times you can have a cooing murmur, cooing characteristic, or a seagull murmur. When you have a loud diastolic murmur, often radiates to the neck, it indicates perforation or rupture of an aortic cusp. And then when you get a murmur on the right side of the sternum, in conditions like aortic aneurysm, sinus of valsalva aneurysm, aortic dissection, and selective perforation or eversion of right coronary cusp, these are situations you find aortic murmur on the right side of the sternum. Austrian murmur, I think, is a low-pitched rumbling murmur at the mitral thing, and I will come back to that in detail. Coming to severe AS, the classical features are pulses, parvus, head tardus, peaking of the systolic murmur. That's a very important thing that oftentimes I find in the examination. That is the most important characteristic an ejection systolic murmur you should describe. That is commonly the most common thing that is missed by a student. So peaking of the systolic murmur, paradoxically split S2, LVS4, apico-carotid delay, often neglected, like nobody talks about it. Thrill, cardiomegaly, LV systolic dysfunction, S3, pulmonary hypertension, heart failure are rare features. I think most of the features actually stand out if they are there. That is pulses, parvus, head tardus, peaking of the systolic murmur, paradoxically split S2, LVS4, all of them stand out in a multivalvular heart disease. So in nutshell, out of all the lesions that I've discussed, what are the things that stand out are aortic valve diseases like pulse and Hillstein, murmur characteristics except in MR, and diastolic thrills generally stand out. S2 generally stands out like paradoxical split in AS as well as wide split in MR, and A2 OS gap, most of the situation, they all stand out. So in a multivalvular heart disease also, even if you find all these features, generally they indicate severity. So some rules of combined valvular lesion is severe lesions tend to dominate and the proximal lesions tend to dominate. Like for example, in a patient who has tricuspid stenosis, it protects our masked mitral valve or aortic valve lesions. And then multivalvular lesions, 1 + 1 may not be 2 because the ability to compensate is quite there. So some of the common dilemma that you all face is if a patient has MR and whether there is associated MS is there or not, because a mid-diastolic rumble can be produced by severe MR also because of the flow, or S3 could be there, which could be confused for a short MDM. So presence of a thrill, prolonged MDM, opening snap, loud S1, and presence of severe PAH suggests the patient is likely to be severe MS. So MS versus MR, how do you assess severity, whether it is which is likely to be severe? I think all of you know this. I think what are the added sounds, what is the severity of PAH, S1, and the most importantly, how is the apex and the diastolic murmur characteristic determine whether MS is the dominant lesion or MR is the dominant lesion. So most common confusion that happens in a patient with severe AR is there AS is there or not. That's a very common confusion all of us have. The most important thing is pulse. I think this is where I think we all err. I think, to be very frank, I erred in this in my last final exam case. So I think you describe some severity and you describe a pulse which is different. And then look for systolic decapitation, which means the systolic blood pressure is lower in a patient with severe AR. And then late peaking, harsher and louder murmur, which is a very important feature is a late peaking murmur. And a heaving apical impulse and the presence of a thrill generally suggests that it could be an AS could be a dominant lesion. AS could be organic, not a flow-related AS. And which is severe? Obviously, delayed upstroke, heaving apical impulse, presence of an S4, and a late peaking murmur and a paradoxical split suggest that AS is likely to be severe. Coming to AS with MR is, I think, one of the worst combinations that you have. And all these combination lesions, you should think over and think of the hemodynamic worsening that is likely to happen. So MR overestimate the LV ejection fraction. It masks the ejection fraction. The decreased contractility in MR can be there. And severe AS worsens the degree of MR. So it actually, both of them mutually worsen each other. And this is the various pathways by which the AS and MR worsen each other. And clinical finding wise, what is the effect of MR and AS, and what is the effect of AS on MR? I think they all are pretty easily, you can just think over it and you can find out them. I think you can, I will be happy to share these slides. I think you can read about all this. So coming to the hemodynamic, this is more important. This is what we expect you to understand. AS increases the LVEDP. So attenuation of the transmetal gradient and the abbreviation of the MDM can happen in the case of the MS. Whereas AS, actually, this is AS with MS. So it can increase LV ejection time, and it can lengthen the A2YS interval and shorten the MDM that can happen. So due to raised LVEDP, the LA pressure may further be elevated. So actually the worsening of symptoms can be there. Whereas, but the reverse is more common, that MS attenuate the physical finding of AS is much more common than AS worsening the symptoms of MS. So what is the effect of significant MS on AS? I think these are the effects that are there. There could be decreased flow across the aortic valve. So low cardiac output state is worsened further. So they actually decrease the clinical findings of AS, but then the less delayed the carotid uptake can be there, less intense ESM can be there, but the most important is from the pulse. So apex is generally less well sustained. S4 is absent because MS is significant. So when you start finding characteristic findings of AS, you think of severe AS in most of the patients with MS. Most common combination that we encounter in your clinical examination is MS with AR. It's pretty common. So 10% of patients with MS have significant AR. Most of the MS patients have some degree of AR, though often not significant. So MS AR generate opposite loading conditions, and then hyperdynamic LV contractility and NDA loading may be less evident. So usually MS symptoms dominate. If the patient has obvious clinical signs of AS present with early dyspnea, pulmonary edema, or hemoptysis, or systemic embolism, always suspect MS. Especially in findings AF and pulmonary hypertension, you should always think of MS, even if you don't oscillate or oscillate with difficulty. So MS may actually mask wide pulse pressure if it is associated with severe low output state. On the other hand, wide pulse pressure or more hemodynamic apex than expected in isolated MS go about associated AR. I think MR versus AR versus Gram-Shield murmur is one important differential you should think of, where I think whether the presence of a peripheral runoff is there or not, and the hand grip or squatting increases the AR murmur. So again, how do you differentiate from symptoms and physical findings? It's pretty obvious whether you have predominant AR or predominant MS. I think it's quite simple and quite obvious. I think it's not rocket science. So this is a very common confusion that happens in the exam, whether it is a MS murmur or it's an Austin-Flint murmur. This is invariably a question that is asked in a patient with MS with AR. So you have a diastolic murmur, which is prolonged with a thrill, or a soft and shorter will suggest prolonged murmur, or a RV at tapping apical apex, opening snap, severe PAH, S1 is loud, AF all suggest MS. As hand grip decreases the murmur, whereas Austin-Flint murmur is increased with hand grip. Coming to the last common combination lesion that you find is AR with MR. So both lesions actually increase the volume overload condition. Actually, both decrease the impedance. But once you have this combination, you should think beyond rheumatic, because connective tissue disease, infected endocarditis of previously diseased valves, all of them can cause this. And I have to understand the pathophysiology behind it. And both lesions can cause brisk rapid carotid upstroke, evidence of LV enlargement, and LVS3 and an apical diastolic murmur. Presence of S4 indicates predominant AR and relatively recent onset of MR. Our evidence of AF and PH suggests significant MR. The MR murmur is generally accentuated, and AR murmur is unaltered. So severe MR, as I told you, MR severity is difficult to assess in the presence of severe AR, because most of the findings you have to rely upon the wideness of the tissue. So this thing is a very good article that actually summarizes all the hemodynamic consequences of various lesions on primarily echo, but I think that helps you in understanding. This is a fantastic summary of all the changes that can happen in multiple mixed valvular lesions because of one effect on the other. I think since you are an echo generation, you can actually easily extrapolate into hemodynamics. I'm not going to discuss in detail. You can all go through this reference. So coming to tricuspid valve disease, It easily escapes reduction. It commonly presents with more fatigue and heart failure. So it actually, most commonly it is associated with MS or other lesions in the left side, but it associated with PND, less PND and orthopnea. JVP is the key, and giant A waves can be there, and you have slow wide descent if giant A waves if there is no AF. It's invariably associated with the pulsatile liver, and number of TS versus MS. You should know location. It is pre-systolic or mid-diastolic, and inspiration augmentation are the one. Coming to low pressure as a high pressure TR, then whether you want to call it organic TR or other etiology of TR, then you should know the difference between low pressure and high pressure TR. These are the various differences. The murmur is characteristically a pansystolic murmur, whereas a low pressure TR will be early systolic with variable duration, which is high pitched murmur in high pressure TR. The shape is a pansystolic murmur, and P2 is loud, and you have CV waves in JVP, whereas a decrescendo murmur with a low pitch murmur, and P2 is normal in a low pressure TR. So you should know the pH classification, I think, which has again been changed. I think you should know how it is classified in children, and you should know the pH classification, I think, which all of you are aware. So what are the signs of pH? Left parasternal heave, a loud and palpable P2. You should compare it with A2. Whether it is heard at the apex invariably means it's a pH is significant. Whether it is palpable P2 means it's significant. Presence of RVS3, RVS4, ejection click, which is a constant ejection click, murmur of TR, ejection systolic murmur, and murmur of PR. These are all the features of pH. So you have PR murmur. You should know how to differentiate between a high pressure PR and a low pressure PR. So high pressure PR is high pitch murmur, low pressure PR is low pitch murmur. Duration is longer, it's a brief decrescendo murmur. P2 is loud and palpable, and other accompanying features of pH will be there in a low high pressure PR. So this is another common problem that happens in non-institute students is how do you assess PVH? So it's actually an assessment, clinical assessment that you make based on the symptom class, presence or absence of pulmonary edema, how much is the cardiomegaly. From an estimate of RA pressure, if the RA is huge, likely the PVH is significant. And from PA pressure estimation, for example, if you have a left side heart decision is producing severe pH, you can't say no or mild PVH, because that is inconsistent with your diagnosis. So these are the ones that you should think that based on your pH assessment, you have to go back and say it is moderate or severe PVH. So all these ways you have to assess the PVH. So PND is not class 4, whereas orthopnea indicate it is significant and is class 4. So how AF modifies the things? AF modifies clinical findings. S1 becomes variable. The diastolic events change. As I told you, A2 gap also changes. The MS and AR assessment becomes significant. How to measure blood pressure in AF is a separate topic in itself. I think all of you should go through that. And all are automated good instruments good enough is a very important question. I think they are now good enough. We all understand now. So coming to LV function assessment in multivalvular lesion, how do you assess? There are very few things like S3 almost always doesn't mean LV systolic dysfunction, especially in presence of MR. But whereas in AR it indicates. Bisvariance means it almost always means normal LV function. Remember this. If you describe a bisvariance pulse, you are likely to have normal LV function. So another important clue that you can have is you have a dilated apex and a diffuse apex in a pressure overload condition or a sustained apex in a volume overload condition. They all indicate LV systolic dysfunction. So I think if nobody is going to falter you if you are not able to make an assessment of LV function, but if you are able to make an assessment, you should say that in your final diagnosis. So these are the various clues that you can get. So congestive heart failure, I think all of you know the signs, the Framingham criteria for heart failure. So some patients can present with early and out of proportion heart failure in valve disease. Immediate differential diagnosis is organic tricuspid syndrome, Lutembacher syndrome, RSOV, EMF and CCP, and if there are other precipitating factors. These are the contemporary series of other precipitating factors in heart failure. I think all of them still apply. Most of the things apply to even our RST patients also. Maybe ACS may not apply, but rest of them can apply. So most important ones are rheumatic fever recurrence, infected endocarditis, and anemia are the ones that are very important. So you should know how to diagnose rheumatic fever recurrences. I think the same criteria can undergo useful. And rheumatic fever clinical diagnosis depends on apical systolic murmur, Carey-Coombs murmur, and aortic regurgitation murmur. Myocarditis can be disproportionate tachycardia, cardiomegaly, gallops, and heart failure. Rarely it occurs in the absence of valve lesions. Pericarditis, you can say rub and effusion. One of my favorite questions used to be, you clinically, how do you say in a patient with established rheumatic heart disease, how do you say the patient has rheumatic carditis on just looking at the patient? So the two important ones nodule, as I told you, subcutaneous nodule invariably means active carditis, and presence of a rub means carditis is there. New murmur, unless your patient has been auscultated before and noted down, you can't be sure about new murmurs. So finally, coming to the last part of the talk, I think it's on hemodynamics from clinical examination, which is, I think, it's quite simple and very easy. You have to have an approach. So JVP, in your language, in the modern era language, it feeds about the right ventricle. Pulse and BP, WhatsApps about the whole of left side. And ASD and RSOV are the ones that the examiners like and the ones that examiners dislike, because they bring out the whole hemodynamic in front of you. So all of you should be knowing about the normal pressures and what are the permissible gradient across each valves. So these are very important ones that you should understand. How do you assess clinically? Patient has patient's hemodynamic from clinical examination. If you find a parasternal lift, generally it indicates pulmonary artery systolic pressure is greater than 50 mmHg. And carotid delay indicates significant aortic stenosis with high sensitivity and specificity. Pulsus alternans, if you find it indicates ejection fraction is less than 30%. And signs of severe PH, you can make an assessment. Palpable PH is generally significant severe PH, and if it is heard at the apex, it's severe PH. The RA pressure can be estimated from JVP. So you find the height of the JVP, you add 5 centimeters to this, and convert it into centimeter of water to millimeter of Hg. That is 1.36 centimeter of water is equal to 1 millimeter of Hg. Based on that, you can get the RA pressure. So you can find the RV pressure or the PA pressure. P2, where it is heard, P2 is palpable, whether there is grade 3 parasternal heave is there or not. And then PVH, as I told you before, PVH or LA pressure, you can estimate from symptom class, pulmonary edema, cardiomegaly, from RA pressure estimation and from PA pressure estimation. And then based on this, in a multivalent heart disease, you can come up with all the numbers based on all the assumptions that you can make from PVH, PAH, RA pressure assessment, blood pressure. You can actually complete hemodynamic sets can be made out. I think you should have a theoretical understanding of how to do that. So the take-home messages is, don't be too restricted in your thing. Have an open mind and never try to reach the echo diagnosis, because we all know that it's quite a good screening tool. But clinical examination should all know the basics are very important. Your thought process is important. Your flow is important. Where you put your weight is important. Not exactly what you diagnose is. I think that is the least important one. So obviously you can't make MS into MR and get away in your final exam. But if you say mild or moderate MS, it's fine. Like those things are fine. The most important, you should not overdo things also, because I think oftentimes echo can be fallacious, intra-op can be fallacious, and postmortems can be fallacious also. We all know that. So you don't have to be too stringent to get to the final diagnosis. I think I try to demystify this mile of multivalent heart disease for you as much as possible in an hour's time. Hope you all enjoyed the lecture.
So over to the panelists now. Thank you, Dr. Rama, for an exhaustive and excellent lecture. And as expected, we have more than 700 people online now, and we are loaded with questions. And it was amazing lecture, absolutely great learning for all of us. So, and we have Dr. Manchand also with us, Dr. Sanjay, Dr. Sir, please.
Yes, I like to make a few comments. I think it was an absolutely outstanding lecture taken by Dr. Rama. But I would like to say some of the pitfalls. I've been an examiner for the last 40 years. And as I would agree with him completely, the final diagnosis does not matter. Actually, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Final diagnosis does not. It is defense of your physical findings and history. I will just like to tell in 1 minute the pitfalls that I have seen in the last 40 years. The first pitfall is in the history of the patient. Most of the people do not know how angina is to be evaluated by Canadian classification. I think all of you should see Canadian classification properly and look at New York heart classification, what is mentioned there. The class 1 is always mentioned as more than normal activity, which is wrong. You see, this is a person with a heart disease and no symptoms, ordinary activity. The second is physical examination. The JVP examination, you see, the examination has to be complete. For example, JVP, you have to see the height of the engorgement, to see the waves and the relation with respiration. These three things, if you do it, that's good enough. The descent is very important. We have seen that the descent sometimes, like the wide descent, shallow, can tell us about tricuspid stenosis and all that thing. And finally, The JVP these days, it is assessed in the sitting posture. 45 degrees is not very correct. You should see that article which is there. Then in the physical examination, you see, again, it has to be systematic approach. For example, firstly, in auscultation, you have to say the normal sounds, then the abnormal sounds like S3, S4, additional sounds, opening, snaps, clicks, etc. And then the murmurs. There are 6 characteristics of murmur, just like you say stenosis. Then, of course, you tell the timing, you tell the duration, you tell the character of the murmur and the frequency, etc., the so-called radiation, and also relation with the respiration. Or sometimes you have to use these additional maneuvers, which many of the students are very poor in. For example, it has to be done with respiration, normal respiration. It has sometimes you have to use this isometric exercise, and most of the people are not very sure how to do at the bedside. I will not go into detail, but I think we can discuss that. You should all know how to do this isometric exercise. In the lesions, he said 9 characteristics. I agree, but in the first, that is the type of the lesion. When you say stenosis, you have to tell the severity, but you can also tell roughly whether it's calcific or non-calcific. In the regurgitation, he said many things. 2 things you have to say in regurgitation. One is it acute or chronic? Because this is very important in some of the diagnosis. Secondly, you have to say whether it's functional or organic. Many times you have AR and MR. The examiners ask you it is functional or organic, or so one should know the difference between the two. Sometimes it is not possible to tell the severity of the other lesion. For example, if a patient has severe AR and MR, you can say severe AR is there, MR, the assessment cannot be made and all that thing. I think the diagnosis of AR and PR is asked many times. There's a patient of mitral stenosis, for example, he has a short early diastolic murmur, whether it's AR or PR. Here you should really know the some of these pharmacological measure and the isometric exercise. This is very important. About tricuspid regurgitation, also the question is asked whether it is functional or organic. Here again, I think one should really be sure that in our country, even organic tricuspid regurgitation is very common. It can occur with severe pH. You saw the classification which Dr. Ramakrishnan told you, that it's a low pressure or high pressure, but high pressure can also be organic, and sometimes one can be very humble and all. So I think what is said, I would agree, a complete physical diagnosis is important. It is not important whether it's correct or not, but if you can defend your findings, if you say that the left ventricle is heaving and your diagnosis aortic stenosis, everybody will accept that. In aortic stenosis, I would again like to tell you the 3 things one has to say, whether it is valvular, subvalvular, or supravalvular. Many times this confusion is there, and one should know the difference between the 3, although this comes in the congenital heart disease and all that thing. But I think one can say that. So ultimately, I think it is your approach to the patient. If your approach is thorough, the examiner knows that you know how to examine the patient. The diagnosis may be completely different. It is defense of your own physical findings and history.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Dr. Ramach. It was wonderful lecture. I think elaborating on the concepts. And our mentor, our teacher, Dr. Manchanda, did mention about some other things. But again, re-emphasizing of what is important is that as an examiner or as an assessee, we are not looking at the correctness of the diagnosis. We are more oriented towards the concepts you are having, and that would be led to by the correctness of your approach, which is much more important for us. Then the correctness of your findings. You know, you should be very cautious about what you report, and there should not be any discrepancies. Then correctness of your interpretation of those findings, just like what Dr. Rama was mentioning. And finally, if you have any discrepancies, there should be a explanation in your mind ready. That means you have done a good thought process. So this is what we are assessing, and it can only come with your experience and by your motivation and by your application of your knowledge to the case in that particular situation. Minded, knowing the diagnosis in particular beforehand is the worst thing possible, because that would screw up all your approach and you'll be always biased. So don't look at the diagnosis, you look at your assessment and your approach, which is the most important ones.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Rama, there is one question that has come up, that what is the basis of this 21 days penicillin prophylaxis? Why do we recommend it within 21 days or 1 month? Is there any rationale for it?
There is a study. I think I can share that study. I think this suggested that the recurrence rate is lower. This is in the 70s and 80s. I think the study is pretty old. I think that is where I think maybe Dr. Manchanda can add on that. Like there is a study suggesting that in highly endemic areas.
Oh, sure. You see, the WHO recommended it should be every 4 weeks. This was the recommendation and all. The studies were done in India, and there is a study available from Lucknow. They found that the degradation of, because of the climate, etc., degradation of penicillin is there after 3 weeks. And therefore, they said it should be done at 3 weeks in the developing countries or where the endemic is there. So 3 weeks, that is the rationale. There are studies done which are not in tune with the WHO. WHO suggested 4 weeks, but there are studies available at 2 of them. And one was there from Lucknow, which they showed that the degradation is much higher of penicillin. Somehow, we don't know why, but maybe because of the hot climate and so on and so forth. So therefore, 3 weeks is important.
There's another question that is coming, that is there any different grading rather than what is generally described and from AIIMS of parasternal heave?
What?
Parasternal heave. The grading.
Parasternal heave? Grade is the same?
Yeah.
I don't think
Only
so.
3 grades.
3 grades.
So there's one interesting question actually. Now, has modified Jones criteria, that is the latest one, ACCHA criteria. Does it suggest that the clinical diagnosis has lost its value, since echo has been taken as a criteria for diagnosing acute rheumatic fever?
So it has actually not lost its value. I think echo in acute rheumatic fever is a big saga. Like it all started, I think, with one of the articles from Dr. Jagat Narula and some papers from, actually Dr. Narang's thesis was that paper, I think, acute rheumatic fever, which was published in Circulation. It all started with that, and then it's a big saga. Like it went on. I think it was overly scrutinized. I think echo is pretty simply available. The problem is that if you do fever and do an echo, many times you can find physiological murmurs. That is why there is a hesitancy on our part to include echo as a criteria earlier on. And then there is various other pointers whether to include or not include. But I think we all now understand that for every case of clinically auscultable by the best people around, I think there are at least 10 times more valvular lesions picked up by echo. So that is clear now. So it's not that it has decreased, but echo is very sensitive.
And also, there is in the seminal article in Lancet 2018, which you definitely quoted. It was very well mentioned that this is enhancing the diagnostic capability. So you are incorporating a new technique, and that study, I think it was by Fredericks, it showed that if you are using echo to diagnose, the possibility of those patients actually developing rheumatic heart disease is almost 75 to 90% as compared to when you are diagnosing it only clinically. So it enhances our. So I think both balancing would be a more appropriate term rather than just replacing.
Another question which I am seeing here is in a nutshell, what is the mechanism or what is the difference between the mechanisms of PND and orthopnea?
So they are trying to ask all the questions that are being asked in the exams.
Yes.
So I think there is this I think is a favorite exam question by many people, and every examiner expects a different answer to this. I think clearly orthopnea is to do with the fluid shift, and the PND can be explained by not only the fluid shift but various other mechanisms that happens. It's like a physical activity happening during sleep. That is the kind of thing that can be explained. There is a lot of component from sleep. There is a component from respiratory muscles. There is a component from respiratory center. All those things play a role in the creation of PND, not only just the fluid shift. That is the thing that every examiner wants, like in a nutshell. You can go through, I think it's very well described by various books.
Dr. Rama, is there any definition of systolic decapitation? Probably I'm not aware of that when we say that it is decapitating.
I think generally it is not in the defined hypertension range. That is like less than 140.
Less than.
So I think maybe Dr. Manchanda maybe add something between PND and orthopnea.
It is difficult to say about decapitation, firstly I talk, because it is the elderly people who have aortic stenosis and the blood pressure is high. Decapitation is related to their original blood pressure. So it is difficult. In a young person, we can always say that it's less than 140. But I think that's not a very good sign in the elderly, where aortic stenosis is seen more frequently. So the decapitation really is only theoretical, I would say. We have seen several patients with blood pressure 160, 170 having severe aortic stenosis and all. About PND and orthopnea, you said orthopnea is very clear that the PA wedge pressure is very high and it's a severe pulmonary all the time present. And on lying down, it increases because the respiratory, excursion becomes less and therefore the diaphragm comes up. But PND, as you said, is redistribution. When a person lies down, it goes over the lungs dependent portion and then it causes that. So I think you are right. There have been other explanations also given on the central nervous system, but this is generally what is accepted.
Well, sir, that Dr. Rama very nicely described the hill sign. And, as many of the people are asking, that definitely it has its value, sensitivity, and specificity. But on the other hand, the new Brown world very clearly says that it's just an artifact. So 4 or 5 people have asked that should we be quoting it in exam as a diagnostic, one of the key diagnostic features or not? So, you have a blend. We have a young examiner also, and we have you who has 40 years of experience. So what would be a take that should we be using it currently to determine the severity of it?
I think it's quite a useful sign. Like still, I think it's no harm in using it with knowing the fact that it may not be reproducible in an intra-arterial tracing. That understanding has to be there, and then still it can be useful. Like it should be useful. Maybe
sir, is there anything like a small water hammer pulse?
So I'm not aware.
Somebody is asking you,
Yes,
we are not
no,
aware. Yes, sir.
It is described, you see, in mitral regurgitation, it's described because the early ejection is quick, although the pulse pressure is not wide. So this is called a early water hammer pulse or the slow water hamming pulse because the ejection is very quick because of, it is very well described in mitral regurgitation. Water hammer with a normal blood pressure, but it gives you the impression when you are palpating it because the early ejection is very quick because there is a sudden decrease in afterload, and also the early part of ejection is quick. It looks like as if it is striking your hand. So it is called as a slow water hammer pulse.
Is that the same explanation for CCP also, sir? Early A2?
Pardon?
Even CCP also has a very rapid ejection in constitutive pericarditis. So there also M2 is a little bit early one. So is that also?
That's also partly, yes, responsible. There the hemodynamics are different. Here you see the afterload is reduced markedly in early mitral regurgitation. So the DPDT is markedly increased. The contractility is increased. As you know, afterload is decreased. The contractility, the initial part, it increases. So it's a sign of early mitral regurgitation and significant regurgitation.
So any other questions? Probably there are so many of them, and I believe that these answers can be very well found in most of the clinical books that Dr. Rama has quoted and many of the articles that he has mentioned. And sir, thank you so much for a fantastic lecture. It's been a great learning for all of us and more than 700 people who are there today. This just shows the enthusiasm. And I also thank our panelists, Dr. Sanjay Mittal and respected Dr. Manchanda and my colleague, Professor Girish MP, and all of you, almost all of you who have been there with us on this journey. So this is all our journey which we are conducting together, and we'll be coming up with more beautiful lectures. All these lectures and slides will be available only for the academic purpose with the permission of our teachers on the YouTube channel, which is purely an academic channel. And you can download these lectures, listen to them repeatedly, learn. If you have any questions, if you want any particular lectures from any doctor, you are free to contact us. You are free to mail to us because this is your program for your benefit. And we are going to continue it for a long time with all the topics. So thank you so much. And I also thank wholeheartedly to INTAS for providing us a platform, purely educative and academic initiative with CSI Delhi branch. So thank you so much, Dr. Rama, Dr. Girish, Dr. Sanjay, and Dr. Manchanda. Thank you so much. And we'll be joining you again next week with another lecture in this series, and we'll be sharing the details of the same very soon to you. Thank you so much and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Well done, Rama.
Thank you.